Abraham Lincoln's story is one of courage, conviction, and tragedy. He rose from humble beginnings, born in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky on February 12, 1809, to become the 16th President of the United States. His life was defined by hard work, self-education, and a deep belief in justice and equality. By the time he entered the White House in 1861, the nation was divided beyond recognition. The Civil War had begun, pitting North against South in a brutal conflict over slavery, states' rights, and the very idea of what America should be. During his presidency, Lincoln faced unimaginable challenges. The country was tearing itself apart, and more than 600,000 Americans would eventually die in the war. Yet, amid chaos, Lincoln stood firm. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, freeing enslaved people in the Confederate States and redefining the purpose of the war. He spoke of liberty, union, and human dignity with a quiet authority that resonated deeply across the land. The Gettysburg Address, though brief, captured his vision of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Those words became immortal, echoing far beyond the battlefield. By 1865, the war was nearing its end. The Union armies, under generals like Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, had broken the Confederacy's strength. Richmond, the Confederate capital, fell in early April. Lincoln visited the city soon after, walking through the streets that had once been enemy territory. Freed African Americans knelt before him, calling him Father Abraham, but Lincoln gently urged them to stand, saying they should kneel only to God. His compassion and humility defined him, even in victory. But not everyone saw him as a hero. In the South, he was despised by many who blamed him for their defeat and devastation. Among them was John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor and a fierce Confederate sympathizer. Booth came from a famous theatrical family and was known for his charm, intensity, and vanity. Though admired on stage, he was consumed by bitterness and hatred toward Lincoln and the Union. He viewed the president as a tyrant who had destroyed the South. Booth's anger deepened after Lincoln's re-election in November 1864. The president's victory ensured the continuation of his policies, and with the war almost over, Booth saw his dream of a Southern resurgence slipping away. Initially, he plotted to kidnap Lincoln and exchange him for Confederate prisoners. He gathered a group of conspirators, including Lewis Powell, David Herold, George Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt, who owned a boarding house where they met. The plan was to capture Lincoln and take him to Richmond. But the war moved too quickly, and the Confederacy's collapse made the plan impossible. When General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, Booth's hope turned to fury. He believed killing Lincoln could avenge the South. The moment John Wilkes Booth landed on the stage floor, pain shot through his leg. He had broken a small bone when his spur caught on the flag draped over the balcony, but adrenaline kept him moving. The audience, still uncertain whether what they saw was part of the play, watched in confusion as Booth shouted his defiant words, waved his knife, and rushed off the stage. Within seconds, he disappeared through a side door, mounted a waiting horse in the alley behind Ford's Theater, and galloped into the darkness. His plan had been set in motion, and he believed he had struck a blow that would change history. Back inside the theater, pandemonium ruled. Mary Todd Lincoln cried uncontrollably, holding her husband's head in her lap. Soldiers and doctors pushed through the chaos. They found that the bullet had entered behind Lincoln's left ear and lodged near his right eye. He was still breathing but completely unresponsive. The doctors knew there was no saving him. The decision was made to move him to a safer, quieter place. Several men carried him across 10th Street to a boarding house owned by William Peterson. They laid him on a bed too small for his tall frame, so they placed him diagonally. As more doctors and officials arrived, it became clear the president would not recover. Throughout the night, those who loved and served Lincoln gathered in the small room. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, Secretary Gideon Welles, and other members of the government stood vigil. Outside, crowds filled the street, waiting for news. The night was long and silent except for the faint sound of Lincoln's labored breathing. Mary sat nearby, overcome with grief. At dawn, as the first light crept through the curtains, Lincoln's pulse weakened. At 7:22 a.m., his heart stopped. Stanton looked at the lifeless body of the man who had guided the country through its darkest hour and said, "Now he belongs to the ages." The words became eternal, marking the moment America lost its greatest leader. News spread rapidly through Washington and beyond. Telegraphs carried the announcement across the country. The shock was overwhelming. In northern cities, people wept openly in the streets. Church bells tolled, shops closed, and flags were draped in black. For those who had fought for the Union, Lincoln's death felt like the loss of a father. Even many former Confederates were stunned. They had expected his presidency to end the war with harsh punishment, yet his death now meant uncertainty and fear of retribution. Meanwhile, Booth was on the run. He rode hard through the night, heading south into Maryland. His companion, David Harold, followed behind him. The two men stopped at the house of Dr. Samuel Mudd, a local physician who had treated Booth before. Mudd set the broken bone in Booth's leg and provided him with a pair of crutches. Booth rested there for a few hours, confident that he had become a hero to the South. In his mind, he had avenged the Confederacy. But he was wrong. In the weeks after Abraham Lincoln's death, the United States was a nation in mourning and confusion. The Civil War had just ended, slavery had been abolished, and the country stood on the edge of rebuilding. But without Lincoln, the man who had guided it through the storm, the path forward suddenly seemed uncertain. His funeral journey from Washington to Springfield had united millions in grief. Black and white citizens alike lined the railroads, waving flags, crying, and singing hymns. For many, it was the first time they felt part of one nation again. Yet, that unity was fragile. Lincoln had been the voice of reconciliation. His plan for Reconstruction was gentle. He wanted the South brought back into the Union, with malice toward none, with charity for all. He believed that forgiveness, not punishment, would heal the wounds of war. His assassination, however, handed power to men who did not share his vision. President Andrew Johnson, who took office after Lincoln's death, was a Southern Democrat loyal to the Union but hostile toward the idea of granting full rights to formerly enslaved people. His policies led to clashes with Congress and deepened divisions. In the South, former Confederates resisted Reconstruction efforts. Freed African Americans faced violence, discrimination, and the rise of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. The promise of freedom Lincoln had championed was betrayed in many ways during the following decades. Yet his legacy continued to inspire those who fought for equality. His words, preserved in speeches like the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural, became a moral guide for generations to come. As the years passed, Lincoln's image began to grow into something larger than life. At first, people remembered him as the man who preserved the Union. Over time, he became a symbol of honesty, humility, and the struggle for justice. His life story, from a poor frontier boy who educated himself by candlelight to the president who ended slavery, captured the imagination of Americans. He represented the best of what the nation wanted to believe about itself, that anyone, through integrity and hard work, could rise to greatness. Writers and historians worked tirelessly to preserve his memory. Monuments were built, biographies were written, and his likeness appeared on currency and statues. In 1867, plans began for a national memorial in Washington, D.C., though it would take decades to complete. When the Lincoln Memorial was finally dedicated in 1922, its towering statue of Lincoln seated in contemplation became one of the most powerful symbols in America. Visitors stood before it in silence, looking up at the calm, thoughtful face carved in marble. The words of his Gettysburg Address and Second Inaugural Address were inscribed on the walls, reminding everyone who entered of the values he stood for: freedom, unity, and equality. Even as his legend grew, Lincoln's assassination continued to haunt the national.